get them. That's fun.
Thank you so much. You can find that on Twitter later today or tomorrow. Thank you for having me. I've been speaking at a lot of places, conservative organizations, liberal organizations, and as a member of panels, a lot of colleges and universities, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm very pleased to be here tonight, so thank you for inviting me. My goal tonight is to address the powerful forces acting upon the information that you see daily, almost anywhere, whether it's on news or social media. The forces behind these influences, I think, can be grouped for the purpose of discussion into three general categories that often intertwine: political or ideological, corporate or other special interests, and astroturf and propaganda. What's wrong in terms of the news when you're speaking of political influence, I think can be kind of summed up in one anecdote that I'd like to tell. True story about C-SPAN. We all know C-SPAN as being, I think, the fairest of them all when you talk about a news organization. They pretty much broadcast raw hearings and interviews and things without a lot of commentary. And I don't think you could say that they have a political bent one way or the other. They're always trying to take calls from all sides of the spectrum. What happened to C-SPAN when the Obama administration came into office? About a year afterwards, Brian Lamb tried to conduct an interview with President Obama to add to a presidential documentary that had already been produced with other presidents, and he wanted to add Obama to the documentary. So he had an interview with the president in the White House Oval Office, and it was very innocuous. It wasn't very long. The two men were standing. It was very informal. And as part of the interview, Brian Lamb said, "You know, I noticed that you haven't redecorated the Oval Office." And the president implied in his answer that the reason he hadn't done so was in the spirit of austerity because the economy was not doing too well, and perhaps it would be unseemly to be spending a lot of money on that. After the interview, a short period of time went by. This was, again, an interview that was going to be saved for a documentary that was coming out in a couple of weeks, going to be updated. And C-SPAN got a call from a White House official. And the White House official said, "You know the interview that you did?" And C-SPAN says, "Yes." And they said, "Well, you're going to read in the Washington Post in a couple of days, story's going to break, about our multi-million-dollar renovation of the Oval Office." And they said to C-SPAN, "We don't want you airing that interview when that happens." In other words, we don't want you airing a piece of an interview that you conducted that was on the record, above board, perfectly honest and public. We don't want you airing that in conjunction with this news because the implication is it might make the president either look like he didn't know what was going on or that he had been dishonest. So C-SPAN was put in this difficult position because the White House is asking this favor, and C-SPAN was thinking to itself, and I'm talking to people at C-SPAN, but I'm just going to say C-SPAN as an organization as if it's a person to summarize the people I spoke with. C-SPAN's been put in an awkward position. So they say, we really don't see how we can sit on this interview if this takes place the way that you say it's going to take place, because it's newsworthy and noteworthy if this happens. And how foolish would we look if we sit on this interview, we hold it, and then we put it in the documentary and it doesn't make sense and it's not quite true and it's out of context. So the White House got fairly insistent about this, that it really didn't want that piece of the interview airing. C-SPAN took it to its board of directors for discussion. And after the discussion, C-SPAN rightfully decided that they really couldn't ethically sit on the interview. If indeed it broke that there was a multi-million-dollar renovation of the White House Oval Office, they would have to air that piece of the interview because it only made sense. So they informed the White House of this, and the White House was not happy. Sure enough, a couple of days later, the Washington Post airs its story, and C-SPAN airs its clip of the interview. Now, let's face it, you guys probably didn't hear about that. I didn't read it. It wasn't particularly damaging, but the White House was really mad because C-SPAN had not cooperated. And they let C-SPAN executives know. They let C-SPAN on-air talent managers know. There were phone calls, there were verbal discussions, and there were emails. And the emails were quite testy. Among the emails, things were said about that this shouldn't have been done, that they felt C-SPAN had violated some agreement or confidence, which C-SPAN denied there had been any agreement to hold the interview under any circumstances. So anyway, another couple of days goes by, and the president is on the air live in the evening making an announcement about troop withdrawal from Iraq. And as the announcement is going on live, someone from C-SPAN gets a phone call. And he's thinking to himself, actually, I'm sorry, it's an email. He's thinking to himself, gosh, I'm getting an email from a White House official while the president is live on the air. What could be so important? And it was an email discussing, again, how disappointed the White House was that C-SPAN had gone ahead and aired this interview. And in some of these email discussions, some of the things that were said implied that there would be consequences for this independent behavior and lack of cooperation in the future, perhaps, for this behavior. And things were said such as lesson learned by the White House, as if a lesson has been learned. And I think what they really meant, because they've said that to me before too, is that they hoped a lesson had been taught. So in the end, that's kind of where it was left. And I thought one remarkable thing is they emailed from the White House that no other news organization would have done this to them. And what I think is they're right. You know, I think that many news organizations, and this is symptomatic of what I think is wrong sometimes, would have cooperated unquestioningly without a lot of debate had the White House made such a request. I think they're used to making requests and getting what they want because there is sometimes the implied or explicit threat of access being withheld that news organizations seem to feel that they want. So after this whole incident, you ask C-SPAN today, and now this was years ago, what has been the result? And they will only tell you that since that time, they have never had an interview with the president, the first lady, or top players, and that there's never been such a dry spell for C-SPAN since it started in the 70s. So that sure smacks of retaliation to me. But the idea that not only that the White House would retaliate in this fashion, but that other news organizations might be intimidated by that and be struck and bound by that is, I think, part of what's wrong with the news organizations today and the journalism that you see. That's an example of political influence, but another one comes from inside. It's not that all news organizations have problems with politics and ideology, at least at the grassroots level. I think most reporters, in my experience, are very fair. Most reporters at the traditional news organizations, they find great stories. They want to get all sides. But a couple of key managers in the mix can taint the whole thing, the whole appearance of what you see on TV, and sometimes that happens. In my view, that happened a lot the last couple of years I was at CBS, and that was part of the reason for my departure. Prior to that, I'd had very good luck. I'd had great bosses who, I think some were liberal, some were conservative, some I didn't know, but all just liked a good story and wherever the story led. I ran into roadblocks those last couple of years, and when it came to be almost across the board about certain original investigative stories that my producer and I, and other correspondents, quite frankly, were having trouble getting on television, meaningful stories that you all would have wanted to see, trust me, we began to theorize and have a lot of discussions in the newsroom as to why this could be. And sometimes it boiled down to it can only be on the part of these key managers some sort of ideological problem that they're having, although that was never said explicitly. Except one time I did get a little feedback, third hand from somebody, and it was when I was doing a bunch of green energy stories about green energy waste. Now, in my view, whether you're for or against green energy, and I don't think anyone's really ever against green energy, they're against the idea of maybe money being wasted or projects that may or may not work or too much effort put into something that may not in fact be doing what it claims to do. But wherever you sit on that debate, the types of stories I did had to do with taxpayer waste on green energy projects. $90 billion of stimulus were spent on was devoted exclusively to green energy. Where was the money going? Well, in many cases, it was going down the tubes. So these stories, to me, wherever you sit, should be valuable because especially if you support green energy, you don't want that money wasted. You don't want the money going to charlatans. You don't want that money going to businesses that had no chance in the first place that the government should have known. So I didn't see these as particularly political stories, but other people did. And I kept offering them. I did a couple that aired, but there seemed to be, after a great deal of pushback from the White House, no appetite for those from that point on. And I kept sending around notes inside CBS with new developments because there were so many going on. And finally, one manager said to the executive producer at the time of CBS, according to the story told to me, gosh, we should be airing some of these stories on the evening news. And the executive producer said back, what's the matter with you? Don't you support green energy? And to me, that summed up kind of what I thought and feared. This shouldn't be about what anybody personally supports or doesn't support. This is about uncovering the facts and the truth of a story, wherever it leads, and not inserting your own personal biases in it, but that was happening too much. So those are examples of direct political or ideological influences. What's wrong with news in terms of special interest or corporate influences can be exemplified by another anecdote I can tell. There are many. I think news organizations are always resisting corporate influences and advertiser influence. There's always that tension. By and large, I think more battles are won than lost, and that's good. But I really think there should be a better firewall between the news divisions and the corporations. And right now, the corporate interests and the advertising interests have become almost one. But along the way, it's never usually said to you as a reporter that a story is not desired because of this reason, so you're kind of left to wonder and speculate. In my case, a couple of executive producers ago at CBS, I had an excellent EP, and he assigned me to cover a number of stories on pharmaceutical industry-related things, such as the cholesterol-lowering statins that were becoming very popular, such as vaccine adverse events and side effects, and the possibility of autism being called by vaccines. We were on a roll. We were covering a lot of these stories, as were other news organizations. And they were proving to be pretty devastating, at least in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, because they were really against them, and they were pushing back like crazy. Again, there's supposed to be a firewall. I'm not supposed to know or care, and in my view, my boss isn't supposed to know or care if an advertiser is upset with a story or cares about it. You all know how many pharmaceutical ads you see when you watch the news at night, and not just the news, the whole network, print organizations, all the sponsorships by pharmaceutical industry. And at one point, I sensed pressure. My EP was pushing back against the pressure, and we were still continuing with these stories for a long time. But he tells a story that I recount in my book that says, one night, and this is highly inappropriate, he received a phone message, and he said from someone screaming into the phone, and it was a salesperson at CBS telling this executive producer that if we kept doing those stories on the cholesterol-lowering statins that we were doing, this would be really bad for CBS. Again, that's not supposed to happen. Another instance in which there was, I think, advertiser influence, or at least corporate influence of some kind, I was covering a series of stories years ago, and as I say in the book, the term I use, the light switch went off, where the stories are well received, viewers like them, the bosses like them, and all of a sudden you start getting this feeling things have changed, suddenly they don't want the story anymore, or stories like it, and that was happening to my producer and I on a number of stories where we were looking at different corporations and charities. And we also were looking into the Red Cross. Red Cross is a great agency full of great people, but with a lot of flaws. Doesn't mean the ground level people aren't good. In fact, those were some of my best sources. And I'd previously won an Emmy Award with reporting on the Red Cross and the misuse of funds after 9/11. So we were continuing our work on the Red Cross, but it and other stories, including auto industry problems and a series of other things, were being pushed back against by certain managers. Finally, a bureau manager said to me one day when she was trying to push back against a story but kept finding there was really no flaws you could find in the story. They were legally approved. They were approved editorially all the way up the way. There was really no reason you could legitimately say they shouldn't air. And she threw her hands up in exasperation and said to me, "I'm told we must do no more stories to upset our corporate partners." And I just didn't know what to say to that. I said, well, I didn't know what that meant, first of all. Who are our corporate partners exactly? But I remember I said, for how long? And she said, until the stock splits. I don't know anything about CBS stock, or I didn't know anything about CBS stock, and I looked it up recently to see when it did split, and I don't think it split during that time period or shortly after, but there must have been some discussion that it would. So I laid off of those stories for a while. There's plenty of other stories you can do, and that's sort of been my methodology. If you find that they don't like an area of coverage, you can always find something else. Until the last 2 years, and it came to be the point that toward the end, before I left, There was almost nothing that my producer and I could offer that they wanted on consumer issues, political issues, corporates, special interests, charities, whatever we tried to do in terms of original investigative reporting, watchdog reporting, which the audience tends to value very highly. We couldn't get those stories on. Lastly, what's wrong with the news in terms of Astroturf or propaganda? Has anyone heard me talk about Astroturf before? Good. Okay, you. You don't have to listen to this part. Does everybody know what Astroturf is? You're a fairly sophisticated political group here, but let me just give you my little talk about it. In my view, Astroturf is when political, corporate, or other special interests disguise themselves and write blogs, publish letters to the editor, produce ads, establish Facebook and Twitter accounts, start charities, or they may simply post comments online. The whole point being to try to fool you into thinking an independent or grassroots movement is speaking when it's not. The whole point of Astroturf is to give the impression there's widespread support for or against an agenda when there's not. There's an entire industry built around it in Washington, D.C. I was covering a story about lobbying not too long ago, and the lobbyists were discussing the importance of these Astroturf methods and how it used to be the direct campaign contributions to politicians that got the responses, but now they've discovered this whole new industry where PR firms can reach out using Facebook and Twitter and Wikipedia and all social media cooperators, quasi-news organizations, bloggers, and you'll never know necessarily who's behind the effort, but it's designed to give you the feeling that there's some sort of grassroots, ground-level thing happening that you should go along with. Astroturf serves to press you to change your opinion by making it appear as if you're an outlier when you're not. One example I like to use is the Washington Redskins name. I'm not taking a position on the controversy. I'm only going to say that if you had watched TV news, read articles about it, looked at social media for the past year or so, you'd probably have to come to the conclusion based on that most Americans find the name offensive and think it ought to be changed. But what if I told you that 71% of Americans say the name should not be changed? Astroturf has controversialized those who disagree with them, and this is how it comes into play with news organizations. They use social media, bloggers, and news media partners to attack news stories they don't like, the news outlets that publish them, the whistleblowers telling the truth, the politicians who dare to ask the tough questions, and the journalists who have the audacity to report on them. Sometimes Astroturfers intentionally shove so much confusing and conflicting information in the mix, you're left to throw up your hands and disregard all of it, including the truth. I think you've seen that or sensed that, probably people in this room, that things are being just thrown out there, all different theories and viewpoints and things that aren't supported factually necessarily, but they're all just put out there so that people will be so confused, maybe they won't listen to the real thing. And then there's Wikipedia. I call that Astroturf's dream come true. Billed as the free encyclopedia that anyone can edit, the reality can't be more different. Anonymous Wikipedia editors, acting on behalf of corporate or special interests, co-opt and control pages that forbid or reverse edits that threaten their agenda. They skew and delete information, blatantly violating Wikipedia's own established policies with impunity, always superior to the poor schlubs who actually think anyone can edit Wikipedia, only to discover that they're barred from correcting even the simplest factual inaccuracies. If you try adding a footnoted fact or deleting a fact error on one of these monitored Wikipedia pages, within seconds your edit may be reversed because someone is watching that page. Someone maybe has been assigned and paid to watch that page and make sure the content stays one way or another. In 2012, the famed author Philip Roth tried to correct a major fact error on Wikipedia about the inspiration behind one of his book characters. But no matter how hard he tried, someone kept reverting the information back to the bad, false information on Wikipedia, and he couldn't figure out why. When he finally reached a person of authority in Wikipedia to try to address the problem, he was told he simply was not considered an authority on himself. A few weeks later, probably more to the point, there was a big scandal at Wikipedia when PR officials got caught offering a paid PR service for publicity-seeking clients. They offered to basically monitor, skew, and edit Wikipedia pages in favor of the clients. That's in utter opposition to the supposed policies of Wikipedia. All of this may be why that when a study compared several Wikipedia articles about medical conditions to actual peer-reviewed papers, Wikipedia contradicted the medical research 90% of the time. Hallmarks of propaganda in Astroturf include use of inflammatory language. Again, these are my observations, such as crank, quack, nutty, lies, conspiracy, paranoid, settled science, everybody knows, denier, and pseudo. Astroturfers often claim to debunk myths that aren't myths at all. The use of the charged language tests well. People hear something's a myth, and they instantly think, I'm too smart to fall for that. But what if the whole notion of the myth is itself a myth, and you fell for that? Beware when interests attack an issue by attacking or controversializing the people, personalities, stories, reporters, and organizations surrounding the issue rather than the facts. I think that's a hallmark sign of Astroturf. And most of all, astroturfers and propagandists often focus all skepticism on those exposing wrongdoing rather than the wrongdoers. In other words, instead of questioning authority, they question those who question authority. These are some of the pressures that come to bear on news organizations now, and they've been quite effective in my view. When I would go out to cover a story, the whole point of whatever interest learned that I was working on a story was to find out as much as they could about the story prior to it being published and to begin the pushback against the story immediately. The pushback might be with, prior to it being published, them using their law firm or hiring a law firm to call our law offices and threaten some sort of suit or legal action, even though nothing had been published and they had no idea what the story would be. And by the way, usually weren't granting an interview or providing good information for the story, but nonetheless wanted to lodge their complaint about it. They also end up dividing and calling news managers. They may call the news anchor surreptitiously, meaning you will never know about it, but they're trying to influence the news anchor and tell them things about the story may not be true that they're about to get. They enlist social media. I was told by one that a single PR person can control fairly easily 50 fake Twitter accounts. By fake, I just mean they're set up on different names. So then they can tweet out under different names, and if you're looking at a topic, you suddenly think, oh, these people feel a certain way. They all think this story was wrong. They all think this reporter's controversial. They all think Benghazi is just a political scandal, when in fact that's not true at all. But you're made to believe this is a consensus. The White House is very good. Probably all administrations have had their own form of AstroTurf, but in this age, this White House is very good at using social media. And I think reporters would tell you has been more aggressive at the business of the sort of pushback that they do. Reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the White House Correspondents Association, the White House Photographers Association, USA Today, have all lodged complaints, either verbally or written, about this administration, and reporters who have covered more administrations than I have and been in the business longer have called this the worst one in modern times on the issue of transparency and press issues. We're in a crisis, I think. One problem, though, is even though we recognize this, we're not covering it, in my view, like the news story that it is. We may write letters, but we're kind of treating it like inside baseball or like a family squabble. This is something to be handled between us. If I were king of the world, I would be putting this on the news night after night as pressure to try to change things. And the news organizations, if we got together and all agreed this was wrong and all agreed to do something about it, I think things could change. But our inaction, in my view, I would argue, leads to a proliferation of this behavior. It gets worse. And I also think each administration has gotten progressively worse than the one before it in terms of how they try to control information and their lack of transparency. And I think the next one, whoever it is, Democrat or Republican, will pick up where the last one left off if we don't change it. If the media doesn't say this is not fair and right and we shouldn't allow this to happen. The federal bureaucracy, in my view, always seeks, for whatever reason, to advance itself, to grow itself, to become bigger and stronger, to separate itself from the public it serves, to covet information even though it's information we own. But the balance is supposed to be the media is not supposed to let that get out of whack. We're the ones that are supposed to be the watchdogs so that we can push back and change that. And we haven't done a very good job of that in the past couple of years. One of the biggest crises I think we have is in the Freedom of Information Act, the total failure of the Freedom of Information Act, and how the media, again, I blame us, for letting that happen. This is not a new problem, but again, it's continued to escalate under this administration, where Freedom of Information Act requests are, in my experience, never fulfilled properly or lawfully. I can't remember the last time I had one that was responded to in the lawfully regulated time. I can't remember one I've had that's provided information that was meaningful. There's supposed to be requests that are answered. This is information we own within 30 business days. I got a response in the last couple of years that was 10 years old, which didn't have anything in it that was important anyway. But it was first news story I was working on 10 years ago. And because there are no repercussions for that behavior, nothing happens, except maybe if you file a lawsuit, and if at the end of the case, the judge agrees the federal entity should have turned over the information, the federal government may have to pay your legal fees, but guess whose money that is? So there's no disincentive for them to repeat the behavior, and it's become rampant, it's become a joke. Both houses in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, have been working on an attempt at a fix, but I argue that what they're working on, though well-intentioned, will have little to no effect as long as there are no meaningful punishments in the law. There has to be a punishment that's meaningful in some sense, or these FOIA officers are just doing the bidding of what their political bosses are having them do. They've added a new political review to the process. Instead of the public documents going out as requested in its pure form, the FOIA officers will say they have to go through a review, which means political officials, elected officials get to look through and sift through that and see if there are things they want to withhold. And whenever the material I've asked for goes through that review, invariably I get little to nothing. Most often I get nothing thereafter. Even though documents have been pulled, somebody up the line politically has said not to give those documents over. And again, as long as there's no repercussions, why wouldn't they do that next time? One last thing I wanted to address before I open this up to some questions. We're going to have a little conversation with RJ and take some of your questions. But a lot of people ask about the specific things this White House does. And I can only tell you in terms of pushback and trying to control the media. So I'm going to tell you a few things in my experience. I know that I believe that they meet a couple of times a day, and that they divide up responsibilities as to who's going to push back and call which news organizations. They didn't just do this to me at CBS. Associated Press gets these pushbacks. Other networks get these pushbacks. Anybody doing stories that they just don't like or maybe digging in the wrong area get this sort of pushback. And it means they launch a multi-pronged pushback campaign. The campaign will be, and this is, in my experience, something that actually happened a lot, they may push back against me personally. An email that's kind of nasty says everything about your story is wrong, although they point to no particular fact error that was wrong. Someone else will call the bureau chief, so that's sort of like your direct supervisor, and he may have a conversation with somebody else. Somebody else has already contacted the anchor of the broadcast to push back and whisper in their ear and say that things were wrong with the story. And another person has contacted the news division president in New York. At the same time, they enlist their helpers, such as Media Matters, who I believe work directly for Hillary Clinton and in the interest of the Obama administration. There's evidence that they pretty much will just often print their talking points and false information. And then that gets picked up by, I call them their partners in the quasi-news, and before you know it, it's in Slate.com, Salon.com. Sometimes the real news media picks up these stories. Once it's circulated through that Astroturf campaign enough, it's almost accepted as if it's fact or real truth. So that campaign is going on. Social media campaign is going on against a story. The direct feedback or pushback is going on with the news organizations. And I think some managers have just decided, in addition to all these other pressures, they don't have time for that. Why invite those headaches when you can fill 22 minutes of an evening news broadcast with other perfectly legitimate, although maybe less important and interesting stories sometimes? Why invite the headaches when you can do something else? And I think a lot of them have taken the path of least resistance. A lot of them have taken to heart direct threats by the administration that they will not have access to certain interviews in the future if they continue a line of reporting or questioning. And I think this is why you see on the evening newscast so often a homogenized product, whereas there's so much news going on in the world today, but they may have the same 7 or 8 stories, all 3 of them. And it's not because they've gotten together and colluded as to what stories to report. It's, I believe, that they use similar decision-making processes to call out just a very narrow slice of what's considered acceptable to them after all of those pressures and factors are taken into account. So I say you have to watch the news these days much like you watch a TV commercial, only you just don't know who the sponsor is. Someone may have pushed an idea behind the story that's so cleverly cloaked that even the reporter doesn't know who's behind it. When I watch the news or see a theme or narrative circulating among the usual suspects, the astroturfers that I've named and others, the quasi-news outlets, maybe an issue pushed by charities and special interests, supposed grassroots campaigns, I can't help, based on my experience, but wonder what special or political interests are behind it, and you should too. Thank you.
Thank you.